Welcome to Tardissian Files. Hello, listeners! Apologies for the long delay between this season's pilot and the latest release, but life, eh? In today's episode, we will be delving into some of the more minute plot holes in Doctor Who that might have escaped some viewers' notice. So therefore, join us as we discuss some of the saddest in-universe truths about Doctor Who. Number 1. Many of the Silurian colonies would have been destroyed by natural tectonic activity. Since their debut in 1972's The Silurians, it has long been established that Homo reptilia and their aquatic sister species, the sea devils, now known as Homo aqua, have been sleeping under the Earth's crust since some point during the Jurassic period. However, despite various groups waking up and clashing with humanity in the Anthropocene era across the 17th, 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, one thing that no group of these prehistoric lizards seems to acknowledge is that geographically, the planet has changed a lot in the last 200 million years or so. Homo reptilia were never meant to oversleep for millennia, and therefore their settlements likely weren't all designed to withstand millions of years worth of tectonic stress in the Earth's crust. Inevitably, in the time Homo reptilia have been sleeping, it's likely that their numbers would have dwindled significantly due to losing many settlements to the forces of time. 2. Hellbent and the Timeless Child arc showed that the Doctor rescued the Time Lords for nothing. They remained corrupted, and they died. Season 10's series finale, Hellbent, saw the 12th Doctor return to Gallifrey, which, through unknown means, had been returned to the main universe by the Time Lords. As it stands, as of the Timeless Child arc, Gallifrey currently lies in ruins at an unspecified point during the end of the known universe. However, it's these two plot points that actually hint to a very sad and harsh truth about the people the Doctor once grieved so deeply and then worked so hard to save. As seen in Hellbent, the Time Lords continued to be led by a resurrected Rassilon, whose manipulations of the 12th Doctor, just to get answers about the hybrid, led to the death of Clara Oswald. The Doctor fled Gallifrey again with a temporarily extracted Clara, just before which Clara chides the Time Lords for the true reason why they refused to return to their native time zone. They were hated by everyone after the Time War, and yet they continued their corrupt ways, seeming havingly learned absolute nothing despite having had plenty of time to reorganise and learn from the mistakes that led to the Time War in the first place. As if this wasn't bad enough, the Master's return after his regeneration into the Spy Master incarnation ultimately led to the discovery of the Time Lords' true origins as the descendants of early Time Lords who genetically modified themselves with the ability to regenerate, using the DNA of the Doctor as a child. In a blind rage, the Master killed all the Time Lords once more. One could argue that the true tragedy of this genocide was that the Time Lords had been given a second chance, and they'd completely squandered it to manipulate the Doctor, just to save their own skins from the perceived threat of the hybrid, which turned out to be nothing more than just the 12th Doctor and Clara travelling forward in time to the very end of the universe, and it just so happens that they were standing on a ruined Gallifrey. It's all round just a very sad truth that the Time Lords were brought back for absolutely nothing. Number 3. The Afterlives of Peri Brown. The original Peri died in a humiliating and tragic way. In 1986's Mind Warp, we saw the villainous and immoral scientist and surgeon transplant the consciousness of the Thoros-beaten mentor Kiv into the mind of the Doctor's companion, Peri Brown. At this time, the Time Lord High Council were desperately trying to cover up the Doctor and Peri's discovery that the planet Ravalox in the year 2 million AD was actually Earth in the near future, having been moved several light years away from its original orbit by the Time Lords in a process that ravaged the surface of the planet. The Time Lords took the Doctor out of time for his sham of a trial, preventing him from rescuing Peri, and delayed her rescue by King Yrcanos so that the procedure that led to Kiv possessing Peri was complete. Now, at the end of the trial of the Time Lord story, it was stated that this was apparently a false narrative placed by the High Council and the Valiard to frame the Doctor, and that Peri had actually survived and become Yrcanos' queen on the planet Contrap. However, this was merely one resolution. In reality, Peri's time stream was splintered into 6 in total, with warring factions within the corrupt High Council and the High Council who succeeded them, causing 5 additional versions of Peri to exist. However, the original Peri, the 6th time stream, had met the very fate that was recorded in the Matrix. She had died strapped to an operating table, gagged, her head shaved bald, in a process that led to Kiv taking over Peri's mind and body, supposedly killing her in the process. That is an absolutely horrifying way to go, that it actually borders on psychological horror. Number 4. Jackie Tyler believed that Pete, her husband and Rose Tyler's father, committed suicide. In Series 1's episode Father's Day, we saw Rose Tyler give in to the temptation and save her father from his death, changing a fixed point in time. The resulting time wound attracted the Reapers, dragon-like creatures acting like white blood cells working to sterilise the wound, consuming everyone and everything in the affected area of London in 1987. When the Reapers devoured the Doctor and the TARDIS, Pete Tyler was left with no other alternative. Now aware that he was supposed to die, he sacrificed himself to the time-looped car that was meant to kill him, restoring the fixed point in time and causing the Reapers to retreat. However, at the end of the episode, we saw that in the revised timeline, Jackie tells the story of Pete's death to a young Rose much differently to how she'd told it at the start of the episode. In the new timeline, Jackie had witnessed Pete step out into the road and in front of the car. As she'd forgotten most of the Reapers and most of the day's events due to the paradox, she went through the next 20 years not knowing why Pete had stepped out in front of the car, implying that she thought he'd ended his own life. Given the utter selflessness of Pete's actions to save the day, this actually comes as a devastating blow to audiences, and of course to Rose, who all knew the truth. Number 5. The werewolf's host was robbed of any chance of a normal life before he had even had the chance to live at all. And he wasn't the first. In Series 2, Tooth and Claw, we saw the 10th Doctor and Rose come face to face with the grandmother of Europe herself, Queen Victoria, in 1879, along with a fearsome werewolf. The werewolf, in reality, was a lupine wavelength haemaveriform, an alien entity of unknown origin which crash-landed in Scotland in 1540, and was helped by Father Angelo's brethren of monks who provided the creature with a host, a child from each generation who would be offered to carry the haemaveriform. By 1879, the mantle of the werewolf's host had passed to a young Scottish man, who had spent his days caged and almost entirely under the haemaveriform's thrall, serving as his mouthpiece while in human form, and then endured the agonising, bone-breaking transformation every full moon. The one thing this episode didn't seem to touch on is that this young man was effectively robbed of any chance for normal life as a child, and he was merely the latest in a long line of previous hosts, who'd all presumably died after the haemaveriform had passed to its next host. This is another sad case of the forgotten victims of aliens in the Whoniverse. Number 6. Torchwood was ultimately destroyed by poor decisions of its leaders. Now, this might be a controversial take, but I cannot emphasise this point enough. Torchwood's ultimate undoing was the actions of its leaders. Now, Torchwood supposedly had 5 branches when established in 1879. Torchwood 1 in London, Torchwood 2 in Glasgow, Torchwood 3 in Cardiff, Torchwood 4 somewhere, probably Dublin, and Torchwood India in Delhi. With the exception of Torchwood 4, of which we only know went missing prior to 2007, the other Torchwood branches supposedly perished because of the negligence, stubbornness, and honestly the hubris of its leaders. Don't believe me? Let's look at Torchwood 1. It was destroyed in the Battle of Canary Wharf, an event that likely wouldn't have happened at all if Yvonne Hartman hadn't insisted on widening the breach that had been left behind when they had probed the disturbance that had led to the sphere's emergence in N-Space, an action which the 10th Doctor sarcastically chided her for. Even if they had to deal with the advance guard of the Cybermen that had already crossed over from Pete's world to theirs, Torchwood 1 may have stood a fighting chance if they had listened to the Doctor and cast the sphere back into the void. Yvonne Hartman refused to listen to the Doctor at every turn, and, in the end, she, along with the rest of her entire staff, were killed, right after Jackie Tyler rightfully pointed out that the Battle of Canary Wharf was ultimately Yvonne's fault. Moving on to Torchwood 2, this little-known branch was managed by the ancient fossil of a man, Archie Bell, since 1899, when he was supposedly transformed into an immortal after an encounter with an alien life eater in London. God knows why anyone would let a man well over 100 years old, who's been branded as a very strange man by his Torchwood 3 counterpart, Jack Harkness, run Torchwood 2 for so long, but by 2009 it seems that Torchwood 2 had simply lost its staff and Archie Bell hadn't bothered to replace them. Admittedly, one could argue that by doing this, Archie did keep Torchwood 2 alive, as it was revealed in the Doctor Who Redacted series that Archie Bell was still operating out of a sound studio and maintained the Torchwood archive in Glasgow by 2023, well after the many deaths of Torchwood 3, but a one-man show is a far cry from Torchwood in its heyday. Finally, that brings us on to Torchwood 3. Now, we did do an episode that covered the history of Torchwood in season 1 of the podcast, so if you want to know the full timeline, please see season 1, episode 8, The Return of Torchwood. However, the long and short of it is that Torchwood 3 met not one, but two untimely demises. First, at the hands of MI5, though I find it highly unnerving that Jack didn't feel a literal bomb in his stomach, nor do I understand why he'd think that unknown gunmen shooting him was in no way related to the 456, despite the Children of Earth serial revealing that Jack was one of the people who dealt with the 456 the last time they visited Earth, demanding a percentage of humanity's children. So I hold him very much responsible for the destruction of the hub and the subsequent death of Yanto Jones. Furthermore, the fact that Jack didn't consider expanding the team so that it was much harder to pick them off one by one as successive aliens did over the 2007 to 2009 period, or at the very least keep a list of potential replacement agents to hand to ensure a fast turnover rate for recruitment, is completely baffling to me. So not only was it just plain thoughtlessness, it was also a lack of the ability to do basic admin work. Then we have Torchwood 3's demise in 2018, when Yvonne Hartman, from Pete's World, who'd crossed over to N-Space in 2007, took over Torchwood from Jack Harkness, after revealing to the new team that he'd been in cahoots with a right-wing terror group, making it look as though he was playing the team rather than acting as a double agent, which was his true agenda. Yvonne, however, was an associate of the committee, Torchwood's unseen, zealous rivals who sought to take over Earth, and because of her incredible lacks of judgment in trusting them, this ultimately led to the already ruined hub being ravaged a second time by an explosion from the rift when the Torchwood 3 team destroyed the bridge that the committee had built to connect their home planet Erebus to Earth. Now, if you've listened to the Torchwood audios, you'll know that Torchwood 3 did eventually move back into the old tourist office that served as the front for the hub under Yvonne's leadership in the early 2020s. However, the blame for them having to leave Cardiff in the first place still rests firmly on her shoulders for trusting the committee in the first place. Number 7. Desiderum's family were never restored after the Rani wished them out of existence. In the opening of the Wish World, we saw the deified human baby, Desiderum, be abducted from his family in Bavaria in 1865 by the Rani. The Rani proceeded to use the baby's reality-altering powers to turn his mother into violets, his father into an owl, and his brothers into ducks. Given that his family was an obscure, working-class family in a time where personal records were often not kept, and given the Rani's penchant for visiting eras of Earth's history at times and places where she's least likely to be detected, it's not surprising that the 15th Doctor couldn't locate his family and restore them to human form. Bear in mind, Ruby had already disempowered Desiderum by that point, so even if they could find his family, they'd have no way to return them to human form. While Desiderum does get his happy ending, it is a bit sad to remember that his family were condemned to live as plants and birds, and it's unclear if they retained their human consciousnesses or if they were completely transformed, effectively killing the humans that they once were. Just food for thought there. Number 8. Rory Williams remembered all the times he died. And so did Amy. As the Silence once put it, Rory Williams, the man who dies and dies again. Never before has a saying been more apt. Whether it's being reduced to dust by an Echnidine in a dream world, being shot by a Silurian in an underground cave and then subsequently being removed from existence, nearly drowning on dry land when fleeing an alien spaceship, being aged to death on board the Saddest, being trapped in Winter Quay by the Weeping Angels, or by jumping off the very same building to negate the previous death, this man was more personally familiar with death than most Doctor Who characters. Second only perhaps to the immortal Jack Harkness. Now, while Rory always came back from these deaths, until his final permanent death of old age at the end of The Angels Take Manhattan, his travels in the TARDIS meant that he remembered nearly every time he'd expired while on his adventures with the Doctor. To add insult to injury, Amy, his wife and partner, also remembered each of these deaths, and the trauma and turmoil she felt each and every time she thought she'd have to spend the rest of her days without her beloved husband. Even remembering being attacked by an illusion of a mad-aged Rory who had supposedly grown to resent her for abandoning him, before next finding his supposed withered skeleton having died in insanity. This moment of Series 6's The Doctor's Wife was especially chilling. It really did feel like something out of a psychological thriller. Number 9. Speaking of Amy and Rory, they were turned into Cybermen? Yes, folks, you heard me. And this isn't too much of a stretch when you think about it either. Amy and Rory were sent back in time to live out the rest of their days in 1930s New York, dying in their 80s, so roughly living until the 1980s or the 1990s. Ergo, they had been dead for at least 30 years by 2014, when Missy's Cybermen began converting all the graves on Earth into new Cybermen, including the graves of, you guessed it, New York. This meant Amy and Rory's corpses were reanimated as Cybermen. Don't believe me? Well, if the Brigadier could come back, why not the Ponds? Number 10. The family of blood killed their hosts. And Sister of Mine was let off the hook by the 13th Doctor. The family of blood were a group of gaseous hunters, almost like the Gelth. However, unlike the Gelth, they preferred living hosts, and when they pursued the 10th Doctor to England in 1913, they took the bodies of local civilians, a process which they remorselessly admitted resulted in the host's consciousness's death. As a result, the 10th Doctor imprisoned each of the family of blood in their own personalised prisons, which would keep them alive indefinitely like they wanted, at the cost of a painful, trapped existence. Daughter of Mine, otherwise known as Aphasia, was imprisoned in the dimension of mirrors, existing in the peripheral vision of every reflection, appearing in every mirror. However, despite her crimes, in the events of Shadow in the Mirror, the 13th Doctor frees Aphasia out of mercy, despite the alien girl refusing to ever apologise for her wrongdoings or learn mercy for herself. While this story was ultimately about grace and mercy, I personally think this might have been reckless on the Doctor's part, because while Aphasia was returned to her home planet, and her short 3-month lifespan would resume, she could, in theory, still potentially return to wreak havoc for the Doctor, as she clearly hasn't learned her lesson. Personally, I think Aphasia deserved her punishment just as much as the rest of her family, and letting her go, despite her not learning her lesson, is sad for her, as she never learnt to be better in the little time that she would have left, and sad for all the people that she killed, whose deaths were ultimately in vain when their murderer was allowed to walk free once again. Number 11. Davros is blamed for being a product of a world that was ruined centuries before he was born, and the same could be said for the Master. We briefly touched on this in our Davros Monster or Misunderstood episode, but I think it is worth reiterating that when you look at his life, Davros' villainous persona seems more of an inevitability than an active choice that he made. In the extended media, such as audio productions like Davros or Corruption, along with various comic stories, we learn that Davros was born midway through the Thousand Year War, knowing only propaganda and hate speech growing up, and he chose to try and serve his people in the best way he knew how, using science. Only to then be crippled by a foul bombardment of the Khalid Dome, leading him to subsequently become the disfigured Dalekoid cyborg that we all recognise today. This subsequently earned him the derogatory second-class status of mutant by the rest of the Khalids, the very same people who he'd sworn to serve and protect. Davros may have chosen to create the Daleks, but it can be very easily argued that he was neglected and abandoned at a time of his life when he deserved recognition for his service and compassion for his situation. He received none, living in a war-torn, cruel world, and remedied his physical pain and the resulting madness the only way he knew how, by creating weapons. Had Davros received the adequate care and compassion he needed, he may not have descended into madness and created the Daleks. The same could be said for the Master, the Doctor's oldest rival, who it was revealed in the events of the End of Time that the Master had been deliberately driven mad when he looked into the Untempered Schism, when Rassilon, from within the time lock surrounding the Time War in the future, planted the sound of a rhythm of 4 into the young Master's mind. This sound would haunt the Master his entire life, driving him mad enough not only to survive the Time War, but to become one of the greatest threats to existence. This was all revealed when Rassilon enacted this plan to break Gallifrey out of its time lock and allow the Time Lords to escape the Time War. Now, the Doctor and the Master, in a rare moment of unity, were able to stop Rassilon, and this led to the Master being dragged back into the Time War along with Rassilon and his High Council, where he was ultimately cured of his undead state after his resurrection went awry. But by this time, it was already too late. The Master would remain in a fragile mental state, which was only further shattered in his Spyfall incarnation when he found out that the Time Lords had fabricated their origin story and were actually the descendants of Sharbugans who had genetically spliced the ability to regenerate from the DNA of the Timeless Child, a being who turned out to be none other than the Doctor. Now, the Master is ultimately more responsible for their own actions than in comparison to Davros. However, it's hard to see a character that's been mistreated so often throughout their lives having anything other than a sour outlook on life, as even when they tried to change their ways in their Missy incarnation, it only led to her and the Saxon Master stabbing each other in the backs. Now, we already know from the prose Face of the Enemy that, in the Inferno universe, the Time Lord known as Kosechi, who did not become the Master, actually grew up to become a dutiful paragon of good, travelling across the universe and saving those in need at the behest of the Time Lord's Celestial Intervention Agency, until his tragic death on the Orwellian-style version of Earth in the 1970s at the hands of the Republican security forces. So, if Rassilon hadn't interfered with the Master's time stream, he'd have grown up to be very much like the Doctor in our own universe. But thanks to the manipulations of others, the Master never really stood a chance at becoming a well-adjusted person. Speaking of poorly adjusted characters, number 12. Cassandra never truly appreciated herself until it was too late. The iconic Lady Cassandra O'Brien Delta 17 was a shrewd businesswoman, borderline narcissist, beauty-obsessed human being who, by the year 5 billion AD, had been reduced to a talking flat piece of skin stretched over a metal frame, with her brain floating in a tank directly below. Or, as Rose Tyler put it, a bitchy trampoline. Now, Cassandra's life is further explored in the short story The Lives of the Rich and Thin, where it's revealed that her entire backstory about being the child of a woman from the Arctic desert and a man from Texas, a noble woman, and quite possibly even being born on Earth, were blatant fabrications. However, despite being a con woman with multiple aliases and a penchant for marrying rich men and then disappearing with their fortune after they conveniently died tragically, the truth about Cassandra is that she was ultimately a very insecure and afraid woman. Having grown up with insane standards of beauty and genetic purity likely being forced on her, despite her cunning and intellect, Cassandra used her admittedly impressive skills not to do good or thrive in intergalactic human society, but instead chasing every fad diet, drug and surgery to maintain an unhealthy standard of physical beauty. A process which she even bitterly cited to be such hard work, clearly demonstrating that despite Cassandra's pride and snobbery, she herself did not gain any joy out of her many endeavours. One might chalk this up to pure vanity, but in Series 2's New Earth, it was further revealed that she was afraid of dying, and had come to realise that there was no place in human society for her anymore. At the end of New Earth, now the dying body of her clone servant Chip, Cassandra was brought to a point in her life from before her many surgeries, and, interacting with her past self, she finally told herself she was beautiful. A gesture that the younger Cassandra would remember fondly right up until the end of her life. This might have been the ultimate self-love moment for the series, but it's incredibly heartbreaking when you realise that it took Cassandra over 2,000 years to finally appreciate her own beauty. Number 13. Humanity survives to the end of the universe, and dies with it as the Toclafane. Doctor Who has never shied away from showing a fairly optimistic depiction of the future of humanity, one in which we survive well past the death of Earth in the year 5 billion and go on to colonise, evolve and thrive on other worlds. However, there is a point when a species' longevity becomes a curse rather than a blessing. In the Series 3 trilogy Utopia, The Sound of Drums and The Last of the Time Lords, we learn that, in the Whoniverse, humanity will survive right up until the very end of the universe, in approximately the year 100 trillion. That is, the direct descendants of humanity, that first evolved on Earth, will evolve and thrive right up until the universe itself collapses. The Doctor, Martha Jones and Jack Harkness help the remaining humans on Malcasario, former homeworld of the Malmuth, escape in a rocket to a supposed Utopia world, expecting to live out the rest of their lives in peace. However, it was revealed that Utopia was in fact a cold, desolate world, driving the remaining humans to desperately take on a new cybernetic form to survive. They became the Toclafane. As the Toclafane, they were found by the Master and allied with him to invade Earth in the distant past, and use a paradox machine allowing them to slaughter their ancient ancestors. Once this paradoxical timeline was negated by the Doctor and Martha Jones, in the true timeline, the Toclafane were forced to watch as their final homeworld became their graves, being swallowed by an entropy wave as the universe finally ended. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I think that with all things considered, the human race of the Doctor Who universe may want to reconsider the lengths they're willing to go to in order to extend their longevity. Number 14. The Earth of 200,100 AD was devastated. 3 major continents were gone. In the parting of ways, the new Dalek Empire launched a vicious assault on the planet Earth. having manipulated humanity for centuries into being a placid, narrow-minded race of people living on a less than habitable planet with struggling governments and a rock-bottom global economy. Suffice to say, in this epoch of human history, they can be summed up in one word against the Daleks: defenceless. While the Battle of the Game Station raged on in the orbit of the planet, the rest of the Dalek Emperor's forces rained down on the planet, and as Linda watched, she reported to the Doctor that the continents of Europa, Pacifica, the New American Alliance, and Australasia being bombed, with the latter being just gone. It was even revealed in the audio drama, The Year After I Died, that while humanity did survive, it was struck hard by the devastation, leading to widespread starvation and rationing, all the while the world fell under the rule of the Hope Foundation, before it was overthrown by a resurrected Jack Harkness. Speaking of Earth, it has been devastated a lot. Number 15. If you look at Doctor Who's extended history, you'll see that Earth, the cradle of human civilization, has been through the ringer throughout its millennia-long history. The most notable incidents of planetary devastation on Earth include the bleak potential future witnessed by the 13th Doctor and her crew in Orphan 55, the solar storms that had ravaged Earth in the 16,000s AD prior to the 4th Doctor, Sarah Jane and Harry's arrival on the Nerva beacon in The Ark in Space, solar flares in the 29th century that led to the human race abandoning Earth 300 years prior to the events of the Beast Below, and arguably the most shocking was the Ravalox affair in 2 million AD, when the Time Lord High Council themselves used a magnetron to shift Earth and its constellation a few light years to prevent a rendezvous between Andromedan spies, some of whom had sheltered on the planet after stealing secrets from the Matrix. The effect was much like a firestorm, devastating the surface of the planet, leaving nothing but the shell-shocked survivors in underground structures, like Marble Arch Station, to descend into a primitive feudal-like society. The fact that humanity is still depicted in the far future as living on Earth, and Earth has not been reduced to an all-inclusive ashtray floating through space, is quite honestly a miracle. And finally, number 16, Miss Kislet's surrender, losing all of her adult life memories. At the end of the Bells of St. John, after a crippling defeat by the 11th Doctor, who had uploaded her to the sentient data cloud Miss Kislet's staff had been using to abduct human consciousnesses as part of an unknown plot by the Great Intelligence, this CEO was abandoned by the alien entity and completely left out to dry. As her last act of service to the Great Intelligence, Miss Kislet erased all traces of it from the minds of her entire staff, including herself. When unit soldiers came to arrest her, however, they found a woman whose entire adult life had been erased, leaving her with the personality of the 8-year-old girl she had been. It was revealed in The Doctor, His Life and Times that Miss Kislet had been abducted by the Great Intelligence after its second defeat by the Second Doctor in the Web of Fear, after she'd been separated from her parents in the London Underground. This is by far one of the worst fates to befall a Doctor Who villain because can she really even be held accountable for her actions at all? There you have it, folks, our top 16 picks for some of the darkest and saddest in-universe truths about the Whoniverse. Did you agree with our list? Did you think of something we might have missed? Let us know in the comments section of your preferred streaming app and follow us on our Instagram, TikTok and Blue Sky accounts for more of our content and to get updates on new episodes of the podcast. As always, see you next time on Tardissian Files.